Yes, you can.
Good afternoon and welcome here in the Nordic Council for this workshop about investment and resilience in LDC countries. We will try now for almost an hour to focus on how to make the investments in resilience in developing countries in the best way for the countries who need the investments, and also for the most effective use of investments from the investor side. So hopefully we can focus on such an issue that we know it will be very crucial in the next year, where we are now preparing for much bigger contribution of investments from the developed world to the developing world due to the Paris Agreement about finance by 2020. It's a big amount of money that shall be invested and transferred to developing countries, and therefore we have been thinking that we have to focus on how to do it the most effective way for both partners, and also how to look at mitigation and adaptation, and also to look at the possibilities to have some connections between mitigation and adaptation. But I shall not speak. I'm a moderator. My name is Sten Garde. I've been member of parliament for many years, dealing with development policies and climate and environment policies. And we have a panel of excellent speakers, and the first I will give the floor is Mr. Amadou Hott, Vice President for Power, Energy, Climate and Green Growth, and President African Development Bank Group. So the floor is yours, Mr. Amadou Hott.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Honorable Satu Hassi, Member of Parliament and Committee Chair from Finland. I'm not sure if... Honorable Eki Esvold Almas, MP, former Minister of International Development of Norway. Mr. Pasi Helman, the Managing Director of the Nordic Fund, Nordic Development Fund. Invited guests, ladies and gentlemen. Let me begin by conveying my President, Dr. Adesina's appreciation for the invitation to join the panel and for the excellent relationship the bank has with the Nordic countries over decades now. As our esteemed shareholders, our work is to ensure that your investments are secured in Africa, that is free, and that Africa is free of poverty, disease, and deprivations. 50 years of experience in Africa's development gives us confidence to share views on what works and what does not work in Africa. Let me begin with what does not work. What does not work is to try to separate the climate agenda from the development agenda. They go hands on. Unless we can find a winning solution to ending poverty, we cannot meaningfully address the climate challenges in Africa. Today, 650 million people in Africa do not have access to reliable electricity, reliable energy. Approximately 700 million people depend on charcoal for cooking. fuelwood, dung for cooking with all the associated health impact. It is estimated about 600,000 Africans die every year because of the exposure to dirty fuel cooking, basically. Needless to say, their energy poverty adversely impacts the climate. With climate vulnerability, communities' coping mechanisms are stretched beyond their abilities to recover. There are the effects that we see today with mass migration and increased urban poverty as a result of population displaced from drought-stricken rural communities. With these conditions, we cannot sit and hope to achieve the objectives of the Paris Agreement. We need to act. What does not work too is to expect that the countries that have contributed the least to the climate problem should single-handedly deal with the consequences of Mother Nature turned violent. We believe there has to be some climate justice as well. Africa should get a fair share of the pledged $100 billion climate finance. It is not just Africa who should continue to receive only 4% of climate finance. Our governments, all governments, are among the major donors. Your governments as well, the major donors to the Green Climate Fund. We ask you to make this call for Africa so that more share of the Green Climate Fund go and fund African projects. Now let me talk about what works. At the African Development Bank, our experience has shown that with good policies and good mix of resources, we can get tangible results. We have repositioned ourselves to better respond to new global demands on our clients, such as climate. For a start, we know that mainstreaming climate resilience in our investments is doing smart business. They go together. We have a host of climate finance facilities that aim to finance risk mitigation on climate and adaptation projects, as well as to create enabling environment to unlock private sector. It is important to use the donors' funds, the public money, concessional finance to unlock massive private sector investments. This is very important. The reasons we are here today is to push of the transformative partnership that the African Development Bank is leading today. That partnership aims to convene all the parties that intervene into the development area in Africa and coordinate all their work so that we can deliver the development agenda. That's why we have the new deal with the African Development Bank. It's a deal of partnership, a new deal that will have the African Development Bank work with all parties, the Nordic Fund for Development, the World Bank, AFD, all the parties, so that we can together effectively deliver on the agenda. For the Nordic region to secure and optimize its investment in Africa, there has to be strong will to deepen partnership, the continent's development institutions such as ourselves. At the African Development Bank, we have created this partnership on energy to pool and efficiently use the scarce resources. We have also created an Africa Investment Forum that will gather all the investors at least once annually so that we can deliver again on the agenda. We are confident that is a winning strategy. And it is, for example, this year's World Bank Doing Business report has seen several African countries improving their rankings. About half of the countries have now ratified the Paris Agreement. These are all positive signs that we need to consolidate. At the bank, we have unveiled a comprehensive program to address universal energy access by 2025. The New Deal on Energy on Africa is aiming to help 130 million Africans or households connect to the grid. An addition of 75 million households through on-grid by replicating the good examples, the success stories that we have in Africa, in East Africa, for example, in North Africa, so that we can connect those millions of households. We also would like to make sure that 130 million households have access as well to clean cooking as well. And there are already some initiatives. We need again to see how we can together scale up those initiatives. Therefore, we are asking like-minded partners to join us in a venture to create wealth while safeguarding the climate. So to answer your question, I have 3 answers. Transformative partnership, local ownership for sustainable and urgent deployment of climate finance. Let's not waste time on perfecting the process before intervening. The pledges must be converted into commitments and then into disbursements without recycling past projects. We're talking about the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for this excellent presentation. And then I'll give the floor to Satu Hassi, Member of Parliament in Finland and former Minister.
Thank you very much, Sten, and thanks for the invitation. Well, the point of this meeting is supposed to be cooperation in order between the Nordic countries and LDC countries in order to help the world meet the 1.5 degrees target. And why 1.5? I give you just one example. Just some days ago, I read that if we can limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, then that means that the global sea level rise will stabilize. But if we only can limit to 2 degrees, then it means that the sea level rise will continue at least centuries, maybe millennia. And that makes a lot of difference. But of course there are many other issues where this temperature difference, which sounds small, makes a difference. Anyway, I have 5 quite simple principles which I would like to emphasize. First, coherence. At the time, around 15 years ago, when I was a development minister, the EU development ministers talked a lot about coherence, and then we meant mainly coherence between our development policy and trade policy. Today, coherence between climate policy, climate goals, and all policy fields are the major issue. Around 15 years ago, that time IPCC President Robert Watson stated that climate is not just an environmental issue, it's a development issue. All our development goals will be damaged if we let climate change to accelerate. And therefore it's very difficult to distinguish between development in general, climate resilient development, mitigation and adaptation. My second point, funding. I agree with the previous speaker that we must meet, we must deliver our promises on funding. But I would like to anyway advocate something which has not been talked a lot, at least I'm not aware of that, so-called innovative ways of funding climate effort in developing countries. Some years ago, Tony Blair was chairing an international high-level experts group on this issue, and they brought these proposals of emission tax or levy for aviation and maritime and shipping, and possibly also so-called Tobin tax. I had the possibility to be in an event where he presented his proposals, and one of the things he mentioned was that the money that is dependent on yearly budget negotiations in the governments, that is much more uncertain than, for example, if we would have a levy for emissions from aviation and shipping. And I think that's a very important point. Well, I understand the argument by many developing countries that it would be against the common but differentiated responsibilities principle. But anyway, if we would have these kind of sources, then it would not be the poorest people in the world who would pay. It would be us, mainly us in the rich part of the world, who are the clients of these businesses. And I hope that LDCs consider this point. LDCs have been a very important force in the process which led to Paris Agreement. I hope that LDCs can also be an innovative force in finding also new ways for climate funding. My third point, all development funding, not just the one which we call climate funding, should be climate streamlined. In this conference some days ago, in the room next to our room, Ivo de Boer, previous UNFCCC Secretary General, was speaking, and he said that when Ban Ki-moon took office, he expressed his wish that Ban Ki-moon raises climate to the top of UN agenda, and that Ban Ki-moon really did. And that his request to the new UN Secretary General is that now when we have the Paris Agreement, then all the UN machinery, all UN organizations, not just UNEP but also FAO, all organizations would work in an intelligent and coherent way in order to meet the Paris Agreement climate target. Finnish Jukka Vuosukainen, whom I know from many climate negotiations, yesterday spoke on behalf of CTC and Climate Technology Center and Network, and he stressed that we must start planning the zero carbon future today, otherwise it doesn't happen. And well, my main conclusion from this point is that we should simply stop development funding for fossil projects. Actually, I tried to find out if the World Bank still funds fossil projects. Pasi Hellman told me that at least not much, but I don't know the truth, but an organization called Oil Change International claims that still last year they funded over 300 million just for exploration of fossil resources. And so I hope that we very soon get coherence also there. And well, my fourth point, everything that we fund must be climate resilient. Infrastructure and everything that we are planning and doing must be done for that climate which is coming, not to that climate which was there. It's not okay that we fund something and then those consequences of climate change which we know about, extreme weathers, storms, sea level rise, droughts, floods, etc., destroy all that which we are building. So all infrastructure that is planned and funded must be climate resilient. And cities play a very important role. Already now, half of the world population lives in cities, and the share will grow. What happens to, for example, to the water pipelines, sewage systems, electricity cables, etc., when sea level is rising? We cannot prevent that there is a lot of infrastructure that is vulnerable, but all new infrastructure that is built must be built in a climate resilient way. And also I hope that we stop funding projects which increase our vulnerability. And for example, in the Bali Climate Conference some years ago, I learned that when mangrove forests in the coastlines are cut in order to have, for example, shrimp farms, then the coasts get more vulnerable to storms and sea level rise. So we also development funding should not increase our vulnerability. And of course, local knowledge, local solutions play a very important role in this issue. My fourth point, which is very close to what the previous speaker said, that is that all climate funding must support eradicating of poverty. And I fully agree with the point that there cannot be meaningful climate policy without tackling poverty. And in terms of development, the climate funding should meet all the same criteria as development funding as in general, and it should respect the priorities of the receiving countries. The most vulnerable people are the poorest people. And also it's very often very difficult to distinguish between mitigation and adaptation. For example, concerning agriculture, I have learned that increasing the carbon in the soil, that's an important way to increase the productivity of the soil, but it's also a very important way of climate mitigation. Also, I think it's an important point that eradicating poverty in itself improves the resilience of societies. When people live just directly from natural resources like rice farming or fishing, they are much more vulnerable to for example, extreme weather events. If people are more educated and have more, in general, more choices in their lives, then they have more possibilities. So that's also part of adaptation. And it's very important that in the mitigation projects we don't violate the rights of local people, don't make the local people suffer. For example, big hydropower projects many times are very problematic in that sense. And by the way, new knowledge tells, new studies tell that also in climate terms of climate point of view, big dams are not as clean as we have been thinking. And well, there have been land issues also concerning wind power projects. I have seen some conflicts in Latin America. I think that such conflicts should be avoided. And my last very short point is transparency. I don't know any single case where it would be the poorest part of population which would have been benefiting from lack of transparency. Transparency is a key issue for doing everything in such a way that we really improve the lives of the poorest people, but it's also important from the point of view of getting acceptance for development funding as a whole and climate funding in our part of the world, because there are a lot of people in our part of the world, unfortunately, who are very eager to criticize development cooperation. So transparency is key in that issue. So thanks a lot.
Thank you very much to Satu Hassi. And then I give the floor to the Nordic Development Fund to Pasi, and we will now be presented of something about mobilizing the climate finance, investment and resilience. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chairman. Distinguished parliamentarians, Vice President Hott, ladies and gentlemen, it's a privilege for me to be able to give this brief intervention from the point of view of the Nordic Development Fund. When I was preparing and thinking what to say in my brief intervention at this event, I decided to take a close look at what the organizers, the Nordic Council, actually wanted to focus on in this event, and I decided I'll follow very much those kind of questions. My points are maybe to be considered more as a practitioner's perspective and maybe less as high-level policy, very important issues that have been raised by the previous speakers. I'm looking at the issues related to climate finance and development finance from the point of view of a fairly pragmatic project financer, climate finance organization. And in doing that, I also wish to explain a couple of concrete cases which actually show how we think we have been successful in climate projects. And I think they also provide some evidence under the broad theme that is here on the wall, namely Nordic climate solutions. There are good stories to tell and for the world to learn. The organizers wanted to focus on how to make sure that the Nordic region and its support to LDCs, particularly in Africa, also promote development in general. It has already been said by both Vice President Hott and MP Satu Hassi that climate and development cannot really be separated from one another. In our organization, this is more evident than perhaps anywhere. NDF was originally established as a development finance institution, and on top of that, some 6-7 years ago, a new climate mandate was given, meaning that we are, by mandate, required to focus both on development and climate. Which of course then leads to us paying close attention to environmental, social issues, and of course those issues are all very, very integral part of both adaptation and mitigation activities in LDCs. The list of strategic focal areas that NDF wants to focus on is by purpose meant to give a view and a picture that there's a specific niche in the broader climate finance, so-called architecture, where a smallish agile, flexible, quick organization can successfully focus on. It means that we are always trying to address interventions and support interventions that can lead into larger interventions that can have much potential to be replicated, to be scaled up. This means almost by definition that we are focusing quite often on the early phases of project cycle, meaning project preparation, piloting of new activities, supporting innovation. This is of course something that almost everybody talks nowadays. We need to be innovative, but I think we have to go deeper than that, and really innovation can be very many things. It can be innovative technology, it can be innovative social approach, and the Nordic countries are a good example of where you can find those kind of social practices, social policies, social approaches that can be innovative as well. And again, as mentioned earlier, since climate finance cannot really be relying on public funding only. Public funding needs to be provided in the way that catalyzes, facilitates, leverages private funding. So these are all very, very clear areas where we want to see NDF funding being focused on. Since we're talking about Africa, just an illustration of the partnership between NDF and the African Development Bank. African Development Bank is our main partner in Africa. NDF mostly does its operations through co-financing arrangements. There's a long history between the two institutions, NDF and African Development Bank. It's also interesting to note that there was a period from 2006 to 2014 where there were no new co-financing activities. But luckily, with the new enhanced emphasis on climate, both at the African Bank and at NDF, since 2014, we have been able to accumulate fairly nice portfolio of co-finance projects, which all have a very strong focus on climate change, either mitigation or adaptation in very many different ways. And then I mentioned 2 or 3 concrete examples of what we have done, some of them with the African Development Bank, some with some others, in order to illustrate what this innovative climate financing might mean in practice. African Bank itself has made very strong pledges in terms of allocating substantial resources and funding to what is called climate resilient development or climate mitigation and adaptation. I'll just mention one aspect here, because even if many have been talking about the need for climate resilient infrastructure development, like Satu Hassi was very clearly, very nicely explaining, it is still not happening to the extent that it should happen. And for example, concrete road infrastructure development and constructions, there's a lot of demand for best practices, lessons learned, how to do those in a climate resilient manner and in a cost-effective manner. So we have joined hands with the African Bank in a number of African countries, where NDF is providing the kind of a climate component in road construction, road infrastructure development, and thereby gaining experiences that can be then shared more broadly within the African Bank, but not only within them, but with other actors like the World Bank and other regional banks, to ensure that we accelerate the climate resilient infrastructure development. This is a very concrete area where a lot of good steps have been taken over the recent 1 or 2 years. And hopefully we can still keep on focusing on this and accelerate this. Another example, a few years ago, African Development Bank, together with the governments of Denmark and Spain, established something called African Guarantee Facility, which is providing financing and improving access to finance for small and medium-sized African enterprises. Now, when we started to talk with the African Guarantee Fund, we thought that it would be interesting if we can strengthen their focus on something called green guarantees or green finance. And this led to NDF becoming shareholder alongside the African Development Bank in the African Guarantee Fund earlier this year. And with our support and assistance, AGF was able to establish a separate window called Green Guarantee Facility, which is significantly improving access to finance for African SMEs that want to do renewable energy investments or energy efficiency investments. Very concrete way of using an existing platform like the AGF to strengthen the green aspects in its operation. A third example, and this is a particular form of maybe a particular financing instrument that NDF manages. It's called Nordic Climate Facility. And this is a call for proposals type of facility where Nordic actors, be they companies, NGOs, research institutions, together with their partner institutions from the African countries, but also this is not limited to Africa only, can send in their proposal for innovative projects, ideas that combat climate change and alleviate poverty in the partner countries. This has turned out to be an extremely attractive instrument for many players, many organizations, and even if it's small scale, it's only up to 500,000 euros per project from NDF, but it also always draws private money in it. It can pilot new things that can then lead into new operations, larger operations, be replicated, and quite often with the help of commercial funding or money from the private sector. So again, small steps, but when they are scaled up and replicated, we can perhaps be getting closer to the transformation that we all are looking for. And I'll end this by just saying a few examples, concrete examples of projects financed by this Nordic Climate Facility, where Nordic ideas, Nordic solutions have been transferred to rural areas, poor areas in Africa, combining new technologies, combining, for example, solar technologies with information technology to enable water management in poor, remote, rural areas, to address maintenance issues in a new way, to address irrigation. These are all products or technologies of Nordic companies, fairly small companies, some, which have now successfully piloted these projects, and some of them have already led into commercialization and replication of activities. And interestingly, all of them were recognized last year by the UNFCCC under the Momentum for Change awards for most innovative climate projects in the year. 16 projects got this recognition last year. 3 of them were getting funding from NDF. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much also for these examples and practical examples of the process of the world in transition. And it's interesting to see that where we try to have a transition in the rich and developed part of the world and in the most rural areas, it's the same technology that's used and the same new methods we have to use. That's a quite new thing in the world. The last speaker is Heike Holmlås from Norway. He's also former Minister for Development. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to my previous speakers that shed some different lights to different parts of what we're talking about here today. So in this very cold part of Africa, it's very cold here, isn't it? It's I have to put on another. I think it's important to start by saying 2 things. One thing is that we talk about development and we talk about cooperating for development. There's one thing we very often forget, And that is when we had development in, for instance, my own country, Norway, we didn't have this grand plan that we always demand now that everyone should have when you start a development project. We didn't have this grand plan for doing everything. We had a very clear goal of where we wanted to be, and we had a very clear idea of where we were standing. And we said it's so important that we move in the right direction. And that's basically what we do now. I remember as a development minister, we demanded all these kinds of comprehensive plans for everything, like the energy sector in a country, and said we should have a comprehensive plan for the energy sector. We never were there when we started doing our own development. So that's one thing. It's very important to remember that we never had this grand plan for everything. We didn't have this big plan. And the second thing is to pick up what on Erik Solheim, the leader of UN Environment, was saying here in the previous session that I was fortunate enough to take part in. And that was, we're on the right track, but we have to rush to speed up that we're going in the right direction. I mean, like the world, it seems now is peaking, hopefully, is peaking on CO2 emissions. We know that prices for solar and water and for solar and battery is coming down, wind is coming down, but we have to speed up. So we know where we are and we know what direction we're going, and we just have to speed up instead of creating this kind of comprehensive plan for where everything needs to be put in place before we know where we're going and what our next step is. Now, that's the fundamental two things that I think is important to shed light on from the start, as a kind of looking back to the past of our own country. I've got 3 bullet points that I think it's important to speak about for these 5 minutes when I'm going to speak, or around 5 minutes that I'm going to speak, 5 to 10. The one thing is that if we're going to do this, stop the climate change thing, and make certain that we stop the most dangerous part, stop the most dangerous effects of climate change, we need enormous investments. Enormous investment. The second thing is that I think it's important that we speak about how we de-risk these investments, because we know most of it will be private capital. And the third is that we want it to create broad development effects and not only focus on the climate issue, but we wanted to create broad development effects. And I will speak on these 3 bullet points because I think this is at the core of what we need to do. Now, start by doing one first. New climate finance, financed partly by Norway and Denmark, I think, and a couple of other countries. New climate finance sets that we need $6 trillion in the period of 2015 to 2030 to hold investment below to have enough investments to get us below the 2 degrees. Now, it's a big number, right? Nobody is able to imagine what $6 trillion means. I'm not able to imagine, but it's a big number. It's a lot of money. And we know 2 things. We know it can't be development aid, all this, right? Simply because there isn't that much development aid in this couple of years. So we have to look elsewhere for finance. I would want more countries to step up the development aid. But if we look at the couple of last years that we've had our pledges since Copenhagen and everything, we know there won't be that much more development aid. So we need to unleash the private investment. Second thing is, we're in a world where more and more of the development aid in my country and in many other countries is going towards humanitarian crisis. Because we've got wars in Syria, we've got in Congo, DRC, we've got many places where you have humanitarian needs, and we have more refugees coming to Western Europe, which means that more money goes to taking care of those refugees, and we call it ODA, right? We call it development assistance, right? And it's recognized, internationally recognized to be so. So I see a bigger chunk of development aid is going to humanitarian crisis and refugees, which means, again, we have to unleash the private investments. Lots of money are out there because there is not a scarcity of money in the world. If you look at what the European Union, the Fed in the US and what Norwegian banks, I mean, like interest rates are at a so low level because there is plentiful of money out there, but the money isn't going in a big enough degree to do the kind of investment in renewable energy and in climate investment in developing countries as we would have wanted them to do. So, how do we fix it? I say we need to figure out, and that's the second bullet point, we need to figure out how to de-risk the investment. And there will be a session tomorrow on Thursday on de-risking investment here in this hall. But I'll talk about it because the NDF has talked about it and the African Development Bank has talked about it. I'll talk a little bit about it too. I think we have to negotiate standard contracts and that has a reasonable profit sharing and make certain that there are blended finance, soft loans, like cheap loans, that can go to the kind of investment that we want. But I'll focus on standard contracts by talking about an Icelandic company owned by Americans. So it's an American company if you look at it from an American perspective, but it is an Icelandic company, Reykjavik Energy. Any Icelandics here in the hall today? Yeah, one Icelander here in the hall today. So I'll talk about Reykjavik Energy that you probably know of. They do geothermal investment. There are plenty of places all along the rift, plenty of places in the Caribbean where there is profitable investments in geothermal that can be done, but isn't done because there is risk attached to it. And since there is risk attached to it, and companies, if a company comes to a state and says, "Hi state, I think I've got a great idea. I would want you to use me as your investor in your geothermal," they would say, "We've never done this before. How should we do it?" Now, the best way to get around that problem is to have two things in place, and one of them is a standard contract. If you have a standard contract that the World Bank or the NDF or the African Development Bank or somebody with a little bit of authority can say, "This has been done before. You could do what this other country did in your country instead." And not instead, but in addition. Then you can get a place, then you can get the things rolling. Because if you have to start from scratch in every single country where you need to have a geothermal investment, then you know the risk for the company is too big. And the country doesn't have a previous example. We do that when we come, when we do that, we do this in politics as well. When we need politics in Norway, it's so much easier to get politics through in Norway if we can say, "Look to Denmark, they've done it in Denmark," or "Look to Sweden, they've done it in Sweden," or "Look to Finland, they've done it in Finland." And then it's so much easier because it's been done somewhere where in a decent place where we know it works there. It most probably will work in Norway too. So that's why I'll say I'll shed light to another example of this standard contract. What the World Bank has been doing on solar, scaling solar project, being able to do something good in Zambia with standard contracts, getting guarantees in place. It's so easy to take that from Zambia to another neighboring country and say, "Look, they did it in Zambia." It's very cheap. I mean, really, really cheap. Not cheap like in Chile or cheap like in Saudi Arabia, but it's really cheap on the African continent, and it can be adopted to another country. Guarantees, yeah. Guarantees, the second thing I'll put on guarantees is saying that, no, I'll drop guarantees. I've covered guarantees. It's important to have guarantees. Guarantees makes, for instance, for a company like Scatec Solar, Norwegian company, wants to invest in Mali or another country in West Africa. They say, "I need a 25% rate of return on my investment," right? They say that. I say, "You don't need 25%. We can't support that." But if you are able for investment from companies, it's a high risk for one company to go into one country where they haven't been before and they need to make profit on their project. It's so much easier for NDF, African Development Bank, a country like Norway to say, "We'll support you with guaranteed because we can have a portfolio of investments." And we know that one or two will break, right? We know that one or two will break, but all over the place, everyone will earn money on this if we can do it and use the guarantee. So I say too little force or money has gone into guarantees and packaging guarantees and standard contracts together, so it's easier to roll these projects out. I'll round off by the third final bullet point, is that saying You have to create broader development effects and co-benefits than just getting the electricity in place. Big electricity project, if it go to mining in a country, doesn't have broad development effects. Gets a lot of money in the case for the company, no, for the country, can be positive for development, but not necessarily. Not necessarily. You wouldn't have the broad effects. Indians in Guatemala, they are not. When you meet with the Indians or indigenous people in Guatemala, when I met with them, they said it's not that we're against the development of hydro projects, but it's just that it doesn't get us any benefits. Now, what we have in Norway is that we have high taxation that goes to the local community, and we always demand that there is a local benefit that gives access to people in the region where you have the development of the projects. I mean, there are so many places in Africa where you can see big transmission lines going and people living underneath the transmission lines that doesn't get the benefit from the electricity. If you have strict demands on that, you can create the positive development for people. You will also see that people will say, this is something that we would want to be in favor of. But you need a local development and the broad co-benefits. So, I'll stop by that.
Thank you very much for also this last presentation. We have used our time, that's the problem. I could like to have some comments from the audience, but I think we have had 4 excellent presentations, and at least as I feel it, we are going from very concrete ideas to the broad spectrum of what shall be done, and listening to what you have said, all of you, I'm more positive and more optimistic than I have been before. But perhaps we still have some discussions about the barriers. Heikki was focusing on some of the barriers and how to solve them, but actually the last word from Mice will be, it's correct for the time being. There's a lot of money out there and they need long-term security, but they should not need very high rent profit. They should not demand high profit, but they should demand long-term security. And I think that's part of the next story, and that we'll take that next year. Thank you very much for coming.
It's an important work you do.